Counterinsurgency. Here you can see British troops deployed in Malaya in the 1950s fighting the communist Malay Chinese. There are four methods of counterinsurgency proposed by Iqbal Ahmed. The first is the conventional establishment. This uses conventional military force to hunt down insurgents and military police to reestablish order in the population. It's preferred by the military because it's not very sophisticated. It rarely succeeds except against Focoists. It was successfully used by the Iraqis in Kurdistan from the 1920s to the present. They would rely on artillery and tanks to maintain order. It failed in Vietnam. Although the U.S. was very proficient, because it didn't address the source of the recruits, the U.S. would kill a large number of communists, but they couldn't stem the recruiting drive. It also failed for the Israelis in Lebanon, where despite having an efficient military, they weren't again able to convince the population not to support acts of terror. The second type of counterinsurgency approach is the punitive militarist. This is the application of military terror to punish the population. It seeks to contain the threat through repression rather than a political solution. It's effective in circumstances where a revolt is limited among an identified minority portion of the population, which is already marginalized. So it was successful in Colombia from the 1990s to the present, in Argentina's 1970s dirty war against socialists, where thousands of students and suspected insurgents were disappeared. In this picture, you can see the roundup of leftists in Chile in 1971 following General Pinochet's coup against the leader of Chile, Allende. Here you can see a picture on the left of 1971 ERP declaring actions in Argentina, and on the right you can see General Jorge Videla, who conducted the dirty war in Argentina in the 1970s. There are successful examples. The Phoenix program, which is originally the ISEX, or Intelligence Coordination Exploitation Operation, was initiated by the CIA director William Colby in 1965 in order to neutralize Viet Cong leadership cadres terrorizing Vietnamese villages. The U.S. and its allies were finding it difficult to win the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese peasants because of a determined campaign of coercion and assassination conducted by these communist forces. Phoenix was operated in conjunction with elite units of the South Vietnamese military, and its unconventional warfare tactics consisted of the gathering of intelligence on suspected Viet Cong targets and their subsequent abduction or termination. The number of dead and captured ranged upwards in the tens of thousands. The success of the Phoenix program compelled the North Vietnamese to abandon their guerrilla and terrorism tactics for conventional military operations. The picture on the left depicts the list of villages as they were cleared of communist cadres between 1967 and 1971. The picture on the right shows U.S. Special Forces, Green Berets in this case, operating with ethnic montagnards in the Vietnamese highlands. These individual communities are very often not ethnically Vietnamese. A failed example was the Shah Pahlavi of Iran in 1978 and 1979, who attempted to deploy his military into the streets to stop the rise of the revolutionaries among the Tudeh Communist Party and the Bazaris, and the army resisted. It would not inflict the use of terror on the population. There was also failure in the use by Somoza of Nicaragua in 1979 when he directed the military to bomb civilian towns that were supporting the insurgency. Ultimately, that did not succeed. In this picture, you can see the FSLN seizing Managua in 1979 after toppling the Somoza regime, and then they subsequently installed the Sandinistas under Daniel Ortega. The third type of counterinsurgency is the technological attritive. This is the genocidal application of force. This works where targeted populations are very weak and completely alienated from the majority. It was successfully applied by the Turkish suppression of the Armenian resistance in the Ottoman Empire in 1914 and 1915, the Hutu massacre of the Tutsi in Rwanda in 1993, and the U.S. government against indigenous people in the 18th and 19th century. In this picture, you can see a Kurd who was gassed holding a child in Kermanshah and Halabja. And you can see Hutus fleeing Rwanda after a massacre of the Tutsi population. It was also unsuccessfully applied in Afghanistan. Although villages were destroyed and poisoned by Russian forces, it simply provoked the Afghans to continued resistance. It was also unsuccessfully applied by the Germans in Serbia in the Second World War. Here you've got German army executing Serbian partisans. The fourth type of counterinsurgency is the liberal reformist. It uses special forces and counter-guerrilla guerrillas, irregular tactics, civil military cooperation, psychological operations, and pacification. It's sophisticated and has a complex method of counterinsurgency. It's most appropriate for insurgents within society, but it's time-consuming and difficult. Successful examples include the October crisis in 1970 in Quebec, in which Prime Minister Trudeau enacted the War Measures Act and sent the military into Quebec, and they quickly rounded up the insurgents. Failed examples include South Vietnam in 1972 and 1975, essentially because of the effectiveness of North Vietnamese forces in challenging the South Vietnamese military. In this picture you can see Gonzalez, a Cuban exile working for the CIA, shortly before the execution of Che Guevara, who's in the center of the photograph. Now, we are going to elaborate on the liberal reformist counterinsurgency, since it is the most complex and it's the preferred strategy because it actually focuses on the allegiance of the population, which is a critical path and the center of gravity for winning an insurgency. So the objective of the liberal reformist counterinsurgency, the fourth type, is reversal of the insurgency, including terrorism. Its two goals are, one, to obtain popular political support, and two, to destroy the insurgents. The case we are going to look at is the British in the Malaya insurgency in the 1950s and 1960s. Here you can see the insurgent cell structure of the communist insurgents in Malaya. You can see how they recruit intelligence, they hire village guerrilla units, local units, regular units of company strength. They have cells of communist sympathizers, they have a propaganda section, and a terror and sabotage section. So this is the location of Malaya, including Singapore, in Southeast Asia. Now the background is the MCP, the Malayan Communist Party, was headed by a 10-person Politburo and built around cells among Chinese workers in mines and plantations in the 1930s and 1940s. These originally indentured Chinese workers were brought in the 19th century in order to conduct the difficult labor of plantation agriculture, as Malaya was a British colony. These insurgents were armed by the British to resist the Japanese occupation during the Second World War, but they kept their weapons after the end of the war. With the success of the Communist Revolution in China, there was an ideological basis for the Chinese in Malaya, who were a minority, to resist their lesser economic status. On orders from Moscow in the summer of 1948, which was sponsoring communist groups globally, the communist parties of Southeast Asia began their insurgency. In Malaya, the movement was handicapped by the fact that the MCP was 90% Chinese in a country where they were only 25% of the population. By 1951, the MCP grew from 6,000 to 10,000 insurgents and had killed 2,000 civilians, and government forces consisted of 60,000 soldiers and 30,000 police. The British had considerable colonial experience and thus applied those lessons from the past in order to deal with the insurgency. Here you can see Gerald Templer, who guided British policy, and you can see a map of the activity in Malaya. Keynote is that most of the population, including the Malay population, live on the west coast, where you see the green bands of territory and where you see an absence of jungle. You just see simply a beige market of land. Most of the Chinese were located along this coast, along with the Malay population, but they also had concentrations of Chinese right up to the edge of the thick jungle. Now, the areas surrounded in red are where a significant amount of the terror guerrilla activity occurred in 1951, when the insurgency was on its upswing. The counterinsurgency was conducted in 2 phases, each with various parts. Phase 1 was essentially a police operation, and its first part was to conduct basic security of key facilities. Following the first act of violence by the insurgents, the British imposed a state of emergency in June of 1948. This granted special powers to the police and the military to bypass certain legal provisions. Here you can see a British convoy that was ambushed in Malaya. Later, these convoys would receive police escort. The second part was the control of movement. There were random searches and roadblocks and checkpoints. Searches ensured that food was not being taken to the insurgents by sympathetic MCP communist villagers. The police set up ambushes in urban areas to surprise MCP communist couriers who were passing information. Here you can see a Malay soldier on patrol in the jungle. In part 3, you had contact, isolation, and surveillance of the civilian population. 500,000 Chinese squatters were resettled into protected villages, isolating them as tax and recruit bases from the communist movement. They only left their village to work, and at night they came back to the village. They were permitted to rebuild their huts in the compound into larger homes. Secure villages reduced assassination against officials. Here you can see the red hash is the population distribution of the Chinese in Malaya. So they exist along the western coast, but also on the interior right up against the jungle. This is a map of the resettlement camps, the new villages that were built by the British that were some distance from the jungle's edge where the squatters were living. The fourth part was to gather intelligence to conduct the counterinsurgency operation. Normal law and order was guaranteed in order not to alienate the civilian population. But 10,000 individuals were seized and questioned under a right of detention without trial, which is a special case under the Emergency Act. Here you can see a train that was destroyed by communist Chinese guerrillas. Part 5 was to coordinate the civil-military operation. A joint civil-military and police special branch liaison group was set up in every district to pass information and intelligence efficiently. Economic policies to help the squatters were also set up to reduce the incentive to sympathize with the communist MCP. New Chinese political organizations were set up that drew supporters from the MCP in a competition. By 1954, the MCP was in decline as a political force. You can see the Malay militia on the right, and on the left you can see a surrendering communist insurgent, not all of whom were Chinese. In Phase 2, you have guerrilla warfare. The first part was patrolling in order to acquire intelligence. Malaya was 80% jungle with a significant swamp and rubber plantations that facilitated insurgent movement and infiltration. Small military patrols were often inserted as paratroopers deep into the jungle to locate jungle hideouts and jungle food plots. By 1954, the British had a complete list of the MCP's senior membership. Patrols pushed the MCP out of the urban areas deeper and deeper into the jungle. Patrolling was generally very time-consuming. I encountered an individual, a Canadian, who had volunteered for this operation as a young man, and 99% of the time the patrolling encountered nothing, and then you had brief contact and chases, most of which involved the insurgents escaping, but their camps were isolated. And so this constant patrolling significantly reduced the mobility of the insurgents and caused a dislocation between the insurgents and the population, which was their tax and recruit base. Here you can see a British patrol in Malaya. Here you can see the vegetation. between the area that's clear of jungle, where most of the population lived, and the jungle highlands, where the insurgents, not on the interior but on the edges to the population center, were mostly based. The second part of the guerrilla phase was the conduct of raiding. This was to collect intelligence and seize the political elements of the insurgency. Seizure of food and supplies denied the MCP the resources to survive. The use of force was strictly controlled by the civil authorities. The goal was to place the destruction of the political leadership, the Minuan, over the military organization. So this is key. The military are a support force. Their main purpose is to stop attacks on infrastructure and to protect the police while the police do the police work. The police do the arresting, the surveillance, the intelligence gathering, the interrogation, and even the planning. Ultimately, the police are the representatives of the legal system, and the legal system is a representative of the legitimacy of the political system, which is the main source of stability. If the British could get the Chinese population to support the political process, then the MCP would lose support and eventually collapse. The third part of Phase 2 are ambushes. To isolate and attrit the military component of the communist insurgency, it was important to eliminate safe havens and target bases. Ambushes were targeted against MCP couriers between groups in the jungle and the civil areas in order to collect information. The intelligence permitted identifying the villages that supported the MCP. The MCP was isolated from access to supplies from China and other communist states. From 1955 to 1960, military operations were used up to mop the MCP. In other words, to collect the remaining military formations, which were so far into the jungle that they depended on food supplies and therefore could be identified. The MCP called for withdrawal to the Thai border, but only 500 made it. On July 12, 1960, the emergency and its special legal provisions was declared at an end. Urban counterinsurgency typically involves the minimum application of force. Particularly, the balance of police has to be much greater than the military. And the reason for this is the much greater danger that the use of firepower will hurt the civilian population and shift them from neutrality to hostility to the government. This is a casualty chart showing the drop-off of violence after the mid-1950s. So you can see the guerrillas killed, captured, and surrendered. The security forces that were casualties, which means killed or injured, as well as the soldiers, and the civilian population. So that by 1960, the guerrillas were being targeted, but no civilians and no security personnel had become casualties. So we have a case which is the big question of why did the U.S. have so many difficulties dealing with the insurgents, and why did the U.S. ultimately lose in its war in Vietnam? And the simple answer is that the U.S. population did not believe that the cost was worth it, as measured in the 58,000 killed and the many tens of thousands that were wounded, and the billions of dollars spent was worth the victory, which in any case would take many more years. After fighting from 1965 to 1972, the U.S. leadership decided to pull out of the war. In fact, the U.S. was never defeated in a single engagement and inflicted terrible losses on the Viet Cong and North Vietnam. Over 1 million were killed. But it is a worthwhile question. Why did the U.S. have difficulty defeating the insurgency? Now here there is a polarized debate between Summers, who was a military colonel, and he's supported by most military analysts, and Krapinovich, who's supported by civilian analysts. It should be pointed out that Krapinovich had a significant positive influence on the U.S. counterinsurgency operation in Iraq in the 2000s. The essential dispute is the threat posed by the enemy, and consequently the center of gravity and the strategy to attack it. Here you can see a loss chart of the Republic of Vietnam, the US, other free world allies, and the Viet Cong. This is a picture on the left of the map of the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley. In 1965, when the U.S. first intervened in Vietnam, which can be seen on the map on the right, the North Vietnamese Army decided to engage the U.S. directly in the interior of Vietnam on its border with Cambodia. The U.S. intervened with helicopters, and although there were a few ambushes against the U.S., the scale of the violence and the destruction the U.S. was able to inflict, even at that distance, with its conventional military force, convinced the North Vietnamese that they would have to continue the war with the Viet Cong and avoid a direct confrontation with U.S. ground forces. This is the map of the fall of South Vietnam in 1975, 3 years after the U.S. withdrew. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam, although it had a country that had a larger population than North Vietnam, was significantly divided and disorganized. And while the military fought well, it essentially didn't have the resources of the North Vietnamese, who were being backed by China and the Soviet Union. And Saigon was occupied by the communists in 1975. Now, Colonel Summers argues that the threat posed by the enemy, the communist Vietnamese, was not the insurgent forces, but the North Vietnamese regulars who could invade South Vietnam and very often joined Viet Cong forces. The North Vietnamese tried to invade in December of 1963, but were stopped by the South Vietnamese forces and by the landing of the U.S. Marines at Da Nang in 1965. These communist forces attacked the South Vietnamese army, making it difficult for the South Vietnamese army to conduct operations against the communist guerrillas, the Viet Cong. The center of gravity is therefore North Vietnamese territory, and the strategy should have been to inflict damage on North Vietnam through bombing and the threats of invasion. During the Korean War, the U.S. fought the Chinese and North Koreans, while South Koreans focused on counterinsurgency with great success. Here you can see U.S. troops fighting in Hue City in 1968 during the Tet Offensive. So this was the Vietnamese plan to attack and invade South Vietnam in 1965. It was essentially to do holding attacks in the north and south, around Da Nang and Saigon, and then to split the country in two. In Vietnam, the U.S. fought the North Vietnamese army as well as the Viet Cong. It attempted to reform the South Vietnamese military, as the U.S. had done in the Republic of Korea with the Korean Army during the Korean War, and then leave the defeat of the Viet Cong to South Vietnam. This was Colonel Summers' recommendation. Here you can see a U.S. B-52 bomber that was deployed against North Vietnam. This is a map indicating the targets in bombing operations against North Vietnam by the U.S. Air Force in 1965 because of its support of insurgents in South Vietnam and because of the intervention of North Vietnamese forces in South Vietnam. Now, the second explanation for the defeat was by Krapinovich. Krapinovich argued that the threat posed to South Vietnam were the Viet Cong guerrillas who were getting access to the South Vietnamese population for recruits for the insurgency. The U.S. should have focused on counterinsurgency first and isolated the Viet Cong from the population as the British had done in Malaya. The Viet Cong center of gravity was access to the South Vietnamese population, 80% of which lived along the coastal plain. The U.S. Army had the wrong conventional establishment counterinsurgency doctrine. The U.S. Army reused conventional doctrines of Europe. It deployed during the day with heavy indiscriminate firepower in the forms of tanks, artillery, and aircraft, and then returned at night to their bases, severing their contact with the population that needed protection from the Viet Cong at night. The Army believed that victory would occur through attrition, as the Army used helicopters and artillery to make patrols to contact with guerrillas in the jungle who would then be bombarded and killed. The American Army resisted breaking their formations into smaller units that were going to be more vulnerable, but better able to intercept and make contact with Viet Cong forces. To use its firepower, the U.S. Army sought battle through search and destroy operations in the sparsely populated highlands. The U.S. could not use its firepower in the populated areas because it was going to be highly disruptive. And supplies were coming to the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese forces through Cambodia and Laos in the highlands along the border of Vietnam. The U.S. Army left counterinsurgency to the Vietnamese in the coastal areas without attempting to reform how the Vietnamese army functioned. There was some success. The losses suffered by the Viet Cong led to an attack against the U.S. forces during the Tet Offensive, which was the Vietnamese New Year in 1968. This led to further destruction of the Viet Cong to the extent that North Vietnam's army had to take over providing recruits. However, the attack, which went against claims by American politicians that the war was about to be won, completely drained American support for the continued war effort. U.S. President Johnson consequently chose not to stand in the next election, and U.S. President Nixon won the election and committed to the withdrawal of U.S. forces. On the left is a map of the Tet Offensive in January-February 1968, and here you can see some Viet Cong soldiers. The map on the left shows the supply routes going into South Vietnam. There's a fair debate over the impact of the supplies because a great many recruits were from South Vietnam into the Viet Cong, and the taxes raised by communist insurgents in South Vietnam largely provided the food supply meant to sustain the war of the communists. You can see on the bottom right a trench system. A great number of underground facilities were built by the Viet Cong in order to hide supplies and hide the insurgents in the jungle. Now, Krapunovich argues that the problem was that the Viet Cong wanted to draw the U.S. forces into the highlands away from the Vietnamese population so that they could get access to the population for recruitment. Most supplies to the Viet Cong actually came from South Vietnam. This is not the same for the North Vietnamese army, which had tanks and artillery, and they got their supplies from the north. 88% of engagements between the U.S. and the Viet Cong were initiated by the Viet Cong because they were lightly equipped and better knew the territory, and they had intelligence from the local population because they had contact with the local population. In general, they avoided contact with U.S. forces when the U.S. forces were too disproportionately strong. The U.S. used, therefore, defoliant in the form of Agent Orange to clear away the jungles to make more visible the movement of the Viet Cong. But this disrupted their campaign of winning the hearts and minds and the support of the local Vietnamese population. The result was that the Vietnamese population was exposed to the Viet Cong, and either through intimidation or agreement, they were less supportive of the South Vietnamese government and the U.S. In contrast to the doctrine of the U.S. Army, there was the U.S. Marine Corps. The U.S. Marine Corps was more successful in its counterinsurgency. They're deployed in I Corps, which is a region militarily defined in the north of Vietnam, which is closest to North Vietnam. So in theory, they were more exposed to North Vietnamese support to the Viet Cong and therefore should have been more vulnerable. In fact, they were far less vulnerable because the U.S. Marine Corps decentralized their forces. They broke them down into small units and they deployed them in the villages in order to win the hearts and minds of the people, in order to collect information, in order to isolate the Vietnamese people from the communist insurgents by doing aggressive patrolling and nighttime deployment in the villages. This forced the desperate insurgents into battle in order to regain access to the population. The population, because of the support they received from the American Marines, gave the intelligence to the Marines as to the location of the insurgents, and the American Marines were able to set up ambushes. This is called combined action platoons. The casualty rate was lower in I Corps than elsewhere in Vietnam in the counterinsurgency operation. The local population became helpful. Only one combined action platoon was ever overrun during the operation. The map on the left shows the deployment and the ultimate withdrawal of American forces between 1961 and 1972, and it shows where the units were deployed in Vietnam. So the general conclusion was that probably a mixture of both of their recommendations would have been most appropriate. There should have been significantly more decentralization of the U.S. military so it could operate against insurgent forces. It should have recognized that the primary goal was to protect the Vietnamese population from intimidation by communist insurgents. The U.S. also should have engaged in more aggressive, conventional policies against North Vietnam, but not going so far as to invade. So in contrast to the American failure in Vietnam is the research question. If it's so difficult to occupy populations, then why was the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, the backing of the communist government in Poland and Romania and Bulgaria, and the physical occupation of Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, why were there no successful revolts in Eastern and Central Communist Europe? Now, this research is drawn from Peter Lieberman's theory, and that is that occupying industrial societies, despite the fact that the populations are better educated, more literate, better organized, and have a sense of nationalism, is in fact much easier than occupying pre-industrial rural populations. And this is the argument. Industrial societies can be atomized, in other words, divided because of division of labor, and broken up so they're not able to successfully organize in order to revolt. This then inhibits their ability to act collectively. So the focus for communist occupation is to isolate populations so that if there is collective action, it's only in a small part of the society, which can then be isolated from the rest and dealt with. This is a graphic showing the Soviet use of tanks to deal with demonstrations. This is a map of Hungary. In 1956, Hungary revolted against Soviet occupation. And this revolt spread from students to labor activists to the military, and then it encompassed the entire population, both urban and rural. And for 5 days, Hungary reestablished its independence. But then the Soviets reinvaded and occupied Hungary within a number of days. There was fierce fighting, and thousands died, including Russian soldiers. The techniques the Hungarians used in Budapest were typical of urban warfare, which was to destroy tanks using Molotov cocktails, deploying various devices like mines to deter tanks from going down certain parts of streets. You can see here soldiers of the AVO, which is the security force, the intelligence police, being executed by Hungarian insurgents. And you can see the Hungarian insurgents, civilians in effect, picking up weapons from the soldiers. Now there is an alternative argument, and that is that individuals are embedded into organizations in totalitarian states, and instead of atomization, the focus is the fact that you have this reprisal system which targets the families in a collective punishment type of system, and it is this that ensures compliance. So this theory would be correct if people, when they spoke freely, would then be afraid that one of their relatives was going to be punished. So in effect, this is a punitive militarist application of terror to punish the population. Eastern and Central Europe under the Soviets was much similar to the occupation of Europe by Nazi Germany. Not only did the Europeans not resist the Nazi Germans in many cases, but they cooperated. In fact, countries like France and Czechoslovakia provided more benefit in terms of military production to the Nazi cause than they cost in terms of the German forces occupying the civilian population. So if you have a non-democratic, ruthless government and there are no restraints to the violence it's willing to inflict on the population. And they're able to keep that population both atomized and collectively embedded, so they're afraid of reprisals against family members, then occupation is relatively cost-effective and easy. A contemporary example would be the Chinese occupation of Hong Kong in 2019 and 2020, and the repeal of the laws that protected civil rights in those areas. This is a list of targets destroyed in Poland by Poles against the German occupation. There are instances where thorough occupation by a ruthless military force is so aggressive that it provokes the local population into resistance despite futility and despite the cost. So now the issue of counterterrorism. The main problem is that terrorists are hard to retaliate against because their bases are hard to find, and retaliation, without producing endless escalation, is difficult. The US believed that most Cold War terrorism needed bastions, in other words, sanctuaries where the insurgents could go and hide. In 1986, the US retaliated against Libya with a bombing strike following the link of Libyan intelligence to terrorist attacks at airports and discos in Europe in that year. It did not seem to produce any measurable effect. The argument that sanctuaries are necessary for terrorism seems to be supported by the fact that terrorism has declined precipitously since the end of the Cold War. The USSR had distributed to states and non-state actors about 75 million AK-47 assault rifles, RPG-780 tank rockets, and SA-7 surface-to-air missiles in order to support nationalist movements around the world that were anti-Western. So the overall conclusion is food for thought. Can nuclear weapons help counterinsurgency? South Africa's apartheid regime had nuclear weapons up until 1992, and in 1993 the apartheid regime reformed and became a democracy. The nuclear weapons possessed by South Africa in the end were not sufficient either for the purposes of blackmailing the international community or of direct use against the African population that wanted to be represented by a democratic regime. Counterinsurgency is essentially about political legitimacy and is won in the hearts and minds of the people, and improved technology is not going to bring about another outcome, unless the regime is completely ruthless.